The Georgia sun blazed merciless over Highway 129, turning the asphalt into a shimmering river of heat that made the air dance like spirits. Thomas Mitchell had driven this stretch of road for 37 years, first as a young farmer hauling tobacco to market, now as a 59-year-old widower making his weekly supply run to town. The drought had lasted 4 months, turning the red clay soil to dust and the pastures to brittle brown stubble. Cotton plants wilted in rows that stretched to the horizon, and the Flint River had dropped to levels not seen since the Depression. Thomas knew every curve, every pothole, every landmark along this lonely stretch of rural Georgia back road. That's why the dark shape in the roadside ditch caught his attention immediately. At first glance, it looked like a fallen tree trunk, blackened by lightning and left to rot in the summer heat. But as Thomas slowed his battered Ford pickup, something about the shape made his chest tighten with recognition. It wasn't wood. It wasn't debris. It was a bull. A massive Black Angus bull lying motionless in the weeds and red dirt, his once magnificent frame reduced to jutting ribs and hollow flanks. Thomas pulled to the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires as trucks and cars continued speeding past without slowing. The bull's coat, which should have gleamed like polished obsidian, was now dulled to the color of ash, caked with dust and streaked with dried mud. His massive head lay flat against the earth, one dark eye staring at nothing. But then, that eye blinked. Thomas climbed out of his truck, the heat hitting him like a furnace door opening. The smell reached him before he'd taken 3 steps, the sour tang of dehydration, the sweet stench of infection, and underneath it all, the particular odor of an animal that had given up hope. Jesus, Thomas whispered, crouching beside the enormous creature. What did they do to you, big fella? The bull was ancient by cattle standards, probably 15 years old, his muzzle gray with age. Scars crisscrossed his hide, old ones from barbed wire, newer ones from what looked like whip marks. His horns, once proud and threatening, were cracked and yellowed. This had been a working bull, probably a breeding bull, used hard and discarded when his usefulness ended. A semi-truck roared past, its wake stirring the dust and making the bull flinch weakly. Thomas looked up at the stream of traffic, watching vehicle after vehicle pass without stopping. A school bus full of children, a minivan with a family heading to vacation. Pickup trucks driven by farmers who should know better. Nobody cared about one old bull dying in a ditch. Thomas had seen plenty of death on his farm over the years. Stillborn calves, chickens taken by foxes, his old dog Jasper who'd finally succumbed to age and arthritis. Death was part of the natural cycle, as inevitable as sunrise and seasons. But this wasn't natural death. This was abandonment. This was cruelty dressed up as economy. The bull's breathing was so shallow that Thomas had to watch carefully to see his ribs rise and fall. When Thomas reached out slowly and touched the animal's neck, he felt the rapid flutter of a heart working too hard to keep a broken body alive. "You're still fighting, aren't you?" Thomas murmured. "Still got some fight left in you." Thomas had been fighting his own battles since his wife Margaret died of cancer 2 years ago. The farm felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories. He'd considered selling it, moving to town, finding some small apartment where the silence wouldn't echo quite so loud. But looking down at this discarded bull, seeing the stubborn refusal to surrender in those clouded eyes, Thomas felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant since Margaret's funeral. He walked back to his truck and pulled out the old canvas tarp he kept in the bed. The Georgia sun was merciless, but at least he could provide some shade. As he draped the tarp over a makeshift frame of fence posts, the bull's eye tracked his movement with what looked almost like gratitude. "I'm going to get you some water," Thomas said, though he doubted the animal could understand. "And then we're going to figure out what comes next." As he drove toward town, leaving the bull protected by shade and marked by orange cones he'd found in his truck bed, Thomas caught sight of his own eyes in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 2 years, they didn't look entirely empty. Maybe saving someone else was exactly what he needed to save himself. Did you enjoy this story? Leave a like to support the channel, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss more amazing content and stories. Thomas returned 2 hours later with his truck bed loaded with supplies he couldn't afford. 50-pound bags of sweet feed, a portable water tank, veterinary wound spray, and antibiotics he'd convinced Doc Patterson to sell him without asking too many questions. The sun was beginning its descent toward the pine trees, painting the Georgia sky in shades of amber and rose. The bull hadn't moved, but his eye tracked Thomas's approach with what seemed like recognition. The makeshift shade had helped. The animal's breathing appeared steadier, less desperate. "I'm back, big fella," Thomas said softly, setting down a bucket of cool well water. "Let's see if we can get some of this into you." It took patience Thomas hadn't known he still possessed. The bull was too weak to lift his massive head, so Thomas had to trickle water slowly into the corner of his mouth, waiting for the animal's tongue to respond. Each small swallow was a victory. As darkness settled over the Georgia countryside, Thomas realized he faced an impossible choice. The bull was far too heavy to move, probably weighed 1,800 pounds even in his emaciated state. Thomas's old truck couldn't handle that load, and calling for help would mean involving people who might decide the animal wasn't worth saving. So Thomas made a decision that would have seemed crazy to anyone who knew him. He pulled sleeping bags and camping gear from his truck and settled in for the night beside the dying bull. Margaret would have understood, he thought, as he spread his sleeping bag on the hard ground. She'd been the one who insisted they keep the three-legged cat someone had dumped at their farm, the one who'd spent nights nursing orphaned calves in the kitchen. The first night was the hardest. The bull's breathing turned ragged around midnight, his massive frame shuddering with each exhale. Thomas sat with his back against a pine tree, listening to the sound of an ancient heart refusing to quit. "My wife died right here in Georgia," Thomas found himself saying into the darkness. "Cancer took her piece by piece until there wasn't anything left but pain. I sat beside her bed just like this, counting breaths, hoping for one more day." The bull's eye glinted in the starlight, still watching Thomas with that unsettling awareness. "Difference is, Margaret had a choice about fighting. You never did you? Someone just decided you weren't worth the feed anymore." By dawn, Thomas's back ached from sleeping on the ground, but the bull was still breathing. More importantly, he'd managed to drink nearly half a bucket of water during the night and had even nibbled at some of the softened feed Thomas offered. Dr. Sarah Patterson arrived at sunrise, her veterinary truck kicking up red dust as she pulled onto the shoulder. Sarah was Margaret's age, mid-50s, with steel-gray hair and hands that had delivered more calves than she could count. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, climbing out with her medical bag, "you've officially lost your mind." "Probably," Thomas admitted. "But he's still alive." Sarah knelt beside the bull, her experienced hands checking pulse, temperature, and hydration levels. She examined the scars, the swollen joints, the clouded eyes that spoke of years without proper care. "Whoever owned him worked him to death," she said finally. "This bull's probably 15, maybe 16 years old. He's got arthritis in his hips, his hooves haven't been trimmed in months, and these marks here," she traced some of the newer scars. "Someone's been using him for target practice with a cattle prod." Thomas felt his jaw clench. "Can you help him?" "Honestly, I don't know. He's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and those infections need immediate attention. Even if he pulls through, he'll never be the same. He'll always be slow, always be hurting." Thomas looked down at the bull, who was watching their conversation with those intelligent, dark eyes. "That's not what I asked. I asked if you can help him." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "It'll cost a fortune in medications and care. And Thomas, you need to understand, this might just be prolonging his suffering. Let me worry about that." For the next 3 hours, Sarah worked with quiet efficiency. IV fluids to combat dehydration, antibiotics for the infections, pain medication to ease the arthritis, anti-inflammatory drugs to reduce swelling in his joints. "He needs to be somewhere he can rest properly," Sarah said as she packed up her equipment. "Lying on this hard ground isn't doing him any favors." Thomas had already been thinking about that problem. His old hay barn had been empty since he'd sold most of his cattle after Margaret's death. The concrete floor could be covered with thick bedding, and there was electricity for heat lamps if the nights turned cold. "I've got a place," he said, "but getting him there is the problem." Sarah studied the massive bull, then looked at Thomas's battered pickup truck. "You're going to need Jimmy Crawford's cattle trailer, and probably his tractor to load him. Jimmy Crawford owned the feed store in town and his equipment rental business on the side. He was also one of the few people in the county who didn't ask too many questions when neighbors needed help. "I'll make some calls," Sarah said. "But Thomas, you need to prepare yourself. Even with the best care, he might not make it through the week." As Sarah's truck disappeared down the highway, Thomas settled back beside the bull for another long wait. The morning was already growing hot, and flies were beginning to gather, despite his efforts to keep them away. "You hear that, big fella?" Thomas said, gently brushing flies from the bull's face. "We've got help coming. You just need to hold on a little longer." The bull's response was to shift his massive head slightly, resting it against Thomas's leg. The weight was considerable, but Thomas didn't move. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt like he had a purpose that extended beyond his own grief. When Jimmy Crawford's cattle trailer finally arrived that afternoon, it took 5 men and a mechanical winch to load the bull safely. The animal was conscious throughout the process, trusting enough not to fight the restraints, as if he understood that these humans were trying to help rather than harm him. The short drive to Thomas's farm felt like the longest journey of his life. Every bump in the road made him wince, imagining the pain it caused his passenger. But when they finally unloaded the bull into the prepared barn stall, bedded thick with clean straw and equipped with fresh water and feed, Thomas saw something in those dark eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. "I'm going to call you Duke," Thomas said that evening, sitting on a hay bale beside the resting bull. "You've got the bearing of royalty, even beat up as you are." Duke lifted his massive head and looked directly at Thomas as if approving the name. Then he lowered his muzzle to the feed bucket and began to eat with the first real appetite he'd shown since Thomas found him. Outside the barn, the Georgia evening settled into its familiar rhythm of cricket songs and cooling air. But inside, something new was beginning. Not just the healing of an abandoned bull, but the restoration of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be needed by another living soul. 3 weeks into Duke's recovery, Thomas had settled into a routine he hadn't experienced since Margaret's illness. Up at dawn to check on the bull, mixing medications into his feed, cleaning his stall, monitoring his water intake. The work was constant, demanding, and for the first time in 2 years, Thomas felt like each day had purpose. Duke was gaining weight slowly. The sharp angles of his ribs were beginning to fill out, and his coat was starting to show hints of the deep black it had once been. He could stand for longer periods now, though he still favored his left hind leg where arthritis had settled into the joint like an unwelcome tenant. But progress wasn't linear. On a humid Tuesday morning, Thomas found Duke lying on his side, breathing rapidly, eyes wide with distress. The bull's temperature was spiking, and despite Thomas's efforts to cool him with wet towels, his condition continued to deteriorate. Dr. Patterson arrived within an hour, her face grim as she examined the massive animal. "Infection," she said simply. "Probably from one of those old wounds we thought was healing. His immune system is still compromised from malnutrition." For 3 days, Duke hovered between improvement and collapse. Thomas barely left the barn, catching fragments of sleep on a cot he'd moved into the adjacent stall. He administered antibiotics every 6 hours, monitored temperature, offered water, and softened feed that Duke barely touched. On the 3rd night, Thomas sat with his back against the barn wall, watching Duke's labored breathing by the light of a battery-powered lantern. The bull's eyes had lost some of their alertness, and Thomas began to wonder if he was prolonging suffering rather than providing salvation. "I don't know if I'm helping you or being selfish," Thomas whispered into the quiet. "Margaret always said I had trouble letting go." Outside, a vehicle crunched up his gravel driveway. Thomas glanced at his watch, nearly midnight. Dr. Patterson, maybe, checking on her patient. But when the barn door creaked open, a stranger stepped into the lamplight. The man was probably in his 70s, wearing clean work clothes and a John Deere cap that had seen better decades. His face was weathered but kind, with the patient lines that came from a lifetime of dealing with animals. "You Thomas Mitchell?" the stranger asked quietly. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Earl Hutchins. I heard about what you're doing here." Earl stepped closer to Duke's stall, studying the bull with experienced eyes. "Used to own this bull, probably 8 years ago. Sold him to a man named Vernon Cross when my arthritis got too bad to handle breeding stock." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. If you're here to claim him, Earl held up a weathered hand. Not claiming anything. Cross is the one who dumped him on that roadside when the bull got too old to service his cows. Cross called me, bragging about getting rid of dead weight. Made me sick to my stomach. Earl moved closer to Duke, who lifted his head weakly at the sound of a familiar voice. "Hey there, Caesar," Earl said softly. "That's what I called him back then. He was the gentlest bull I ever raised, despite his size. Never showed aggression toward humans, not even when he was in his prime." The bull, Caesar not Duke, made a low rumbling sound in his throat that Thomas had never heard before. Recognition. "He remembers you," Thomas said. "Bulls have long memories. Caesar here was bottle-fed as a calf after his mother died. Hand-raised him myself until he was weaned." Earl's voice carried the weight of old affection and recent guilt. "I should have made sure Cross was a decent man before I sold him. Should have checked on him over the years." Earl pulled a small paper bag from his jacket pocket. "Used to give him peppermint candies as treats. Probably shouldn't now with his condition, but..." Thomas watched as Earl unwrapped a single peppermint and held it on his palm. Caesar's nostrils flared, and despite his weakness, he stretched his neck forward to accept the candy with gentle lips. "Thomas, I came here to offer help. I know what medications cost, what feed runs, what this kind of care adds up to." Earl reached into his other pocket and pulled out an envelope. "It's not charity. It's responsibility I should have taken years ago." Thomas looked at the envelope without touching it. "I didn't save him for money." "I know that, but Caesar was my bull once and I failed him. Let me help make it right." For the next 2 hours, Earl shared stories about Caesar's younger years. How he'd been the herd's protector, positioning himself between the cows and any perceived threat. How he'd been gentle with children who climbed through the fence to pet him. How he'd sired calves that were healthy, strong, and carried his calm temperament. "Cross worked him too hard, too long," Earl said, as dawnlight began filtering through the barn windows. "Used him for breeding until he was too old, then probably tried to work him like a draft animal when his fertility declined. Caesar deserved better than that." As Earl prepared to leave, he turned back toward Caesar's stall. "You're in good hands now, old friend. This man here stopped when everyone else kept driving. That tells me everything I need to know about his character." Caesar lifted his head as Earl departed, watching until the old man disappeared from view. Then he turned toward Thomas with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been in days. "Caesar," Thomas said, testing the name. It fit better than Duke. More dignified, more suitable for an animal who'd earned respect through gentleness rather than aggression. That afternoon, Caesar's fever finally broke. He drank a full bucket of water and ate 2 scoops of sweet feed without coaxing. When Thomas entered the stall to clean around him, Caesar turned his massive head and pressed his muzzle against Thomas's shoulder, the first truly affectionate gesture he'd shown since his rescue. "We're going to get you well," Thomas promised, scratching behind Caesar's ears. "You've got a friend helping now, and you've got a name that fits who you really are." As evening settled over the farm, Thomas sat on his porch for the first time in weeks, listening to the steady sounds of Caesar moving around his stall. The crisis had passed, but more than that, Thomas had learned something important about his rescued bull. Caesar hadn't just been abandoned by strangers, he'd been betrayed by people who should have protected him. The fact that he was still capable of trust, still able to accept kindness from humans, spoke to a strength of character that humbled Thomas. Maybe they were both learning how to heal from betrayal. Maybe that was what recovery really meant. Not just physical healing, but the courage to trust again despite past wounds. By October, Caesar had transformed from the broken animal Thomas had found dying in a roadside ditch. The bull's weight had increased by nearly 300 pounds, his coat gleamed with health, and his movements carried dignity despite lingering arthritis. Word of his recovery had spread through the county, bringing friendly visitors who saw his story as one of redemption. But on a cold Thursday morning, the sound of diesel engines made Caesar lift his massive head from grazing, nostrils flaring with alarm. 3 black pickup trucks turned into Thomas's driveway, their chrome and tinted windows speaking of money and intimidation. Vernon Cross climbed out of the lead truck, flanked by 2 younger men who carried themselves like hired muscle. Cross was a big man gone soft, with small eyes that calculated profit in everything they saw. "Well, I'll be damned," Cross called out with false friendliness. Look what turned up healthy as a prize bull. You've done real good work here, Mitchell. Caesar had backed against the far fence, every muscle in his 1,800-pound frame tense with recognition. The gentle giant who followed Thomas like a loyal dog was trembling, eyes wide with terror. "What do you want, Cross?" Thomas asked, setting down his feed bucket. Cross pulled out folded papers, waving them like a victory flag. "I want what's mine. This bull belongs to me. Got the bill of sale right here." Thomas looked at Caesar, pressed against the fence, making low sounds of distress. "That bull was dying in a ditch when I found him. You threw him away." "Animals wander off sometimes," Cross shrugged with chilling indifference. "But I got to hand it to you. You probably added $5,000 to his value with all that care." The casual admission hit Thomas like a slap. Cross had come to profit from Thomas's months of expensive care and sleepless nights. "He's not going anywhere with you," Thomas said quietly. Cross's mask slipped. "I've got legal ownership and the manpower to collect what's mine." He nodded to his men, who began moving towards Caesar's gate. Caesar bellowed, pure panic that sent birds exploding from trees. The bull reared back, massive hooves striking the fence as he tried desperately to escape. "Easy there, Duke," Cross called, using a name that made Caesar flinch. "Time to come home and earn your keep." Thomas stepped between the men and Caesar's gate. At 59, 4 decades of farm work had kept him strong, and something in his eyes made Cross's men hesitate. "You're not taking him," Thomas said with quiet authority. That's when approaching vehicles changed everything. Dr. Patterson's truck appeared first, followed by Earl Hutchins, then Sheriff Rawlings. Word had spread. When trouble brewed at Thomas Mitchell's farm, good people showed up. Cross's confidence evaporated. "This is private business, Sheriff." Sheriff Rawlings was lean, experienced in recognizing bullies regardless of expensive boots. "Disputes about ownership and potential theft are my business." Dr. Patterson approached Caesar's paddock, and the bull immediately moved toward her familiar voice. "Sheriff, I've been treating this bull for 4 months. When Thomas brought him to me, he was hours from death. Severe malnutrition, infections, evidence of prolonged abuse." Earl Hutchins stepped forward, face set with guilt-driven determination. "That animal's Caesar. I raised him, sold him to Cross 8 years ago. Biggest mistake I made. Cross called me 3 months back bragging about dumping him when he got too old to be profitable." Cross's face flushed red. "That's hearsay. I've got documented ownership." He thrust the bill of sale toward the sheriff. Sheriff Rawlings examined the paperwork, then looked at Caesar, still pressed against the fence in obvious terror. "Dr. Patterson, does this animal show trauma signs related to specific individuals?" "Absolutely. His fear response to Cross is textbook abused animal behavior. In contrast, he shows complete trust toward Thomas." Thomas called softly, "Come here, Caesar." The massive bull immediately approached, pressing his head against Thomas's chest. The contrast with his terrified reaction to Cross was unmistakable. "Property is property," Cross sputtered. "He's worth money and he's mine." Sheriff Rawlings studied the scene. Cowering bull, determined rescuer, obvious bond. Cross stepped back. "This is a civil matter for Judge Whitmore. Until then, this bull stays exactly where he is." "You can't do that. Mr. Mitchell's got possession, veterinary bills, and documented rescue evidence. Court will sort out who owes what to whom." As Cross and his men drove away, engines roaring with defeated anger, Thomas felt Caesar's warm breath on his shoulder. The bull had moved close, seeking protection. "It's all right, boy," Thomas murmured. "They're gone." Earl approached with an envelope. "This should cover legal fees. I've got guilt to make up for." Dr. Patterson was photographing Caesar's calm behavior. "I'll prepare complete medical reports for court." As sunset painted the Georgia sky, Thomas stood with Caesar in their shared paddock. The bull from the roadside ditch had become family, purpose, hope. "Whatever happens in court," Thomas promised, "I won't let them take you back. We've both learned what kindness means." Caesar pressed against him with complete trust. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and legal battles, but tonight they had each other, community support, and a bond worth any fight to preserve. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood outside the Spalding County Courthouse, Caesar beside him on a specially reinforced trailer that had become necessary when the judge insisted on seeing the bull in person. The morning was crisp, with autumn leaves swirling in the Georgia breeze, and a crowd had gathered to witness what the local newspaper had dubbed the case of the rescued bull. Dr. I. Patterson had spent hours preparing her testimony, armed with medical records, photographs, and x-rays that told the story of Caesar's recovery in stark detail. Earl Hutchins clutched a folder containing 8 years of guilt and documentation about Caesar's gentle nature as a young bull. Sheriff Rawlings would testify about the obvious behavioral differences he'd witnessed. Vernon Cross arrived in a convoy of legal muscle, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, briefcases full of property law precedents, and an attitude that suggested he considered this entire proceeding a formality before reclaiming his investment. Judge Martha Whitmore had been on the bench for 23 years, long enough to see every variation of human nature parade through her courtroom. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, known throughout the county for fairness tempered with no-nonsense pragmatism. This court will hear the matter of Cross versus Mitchell regarding ownership of one Black Angus bull, Judge Whitmore announced, her voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. Mr. Cross, present your case. Cross's lead attorney, a polished man from Atlanta, stood with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning property disputes through superior legal firepower. Your Honor, the facts are simple. My client purchased this bull legally, as documented by bill of sale. Temporary wandering by livestock doesn't void ownership. Mr. Mitchell, while well-intentioned, has no legal claim to another man's property. He presented Cross's paperwork with theatrical precision, emphasizing dates, signatures, and the black-letter law of property ownership. For 30 minutes, he built a case that sounded airtight, until Judge Whitmore asked to see the bull. Caesar was led into the courthouse parking lot, where a makeshift examination area had been set up. The moment Cross approached, Caesar's transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The gentle giant who'd calmly accepted the trailer ride in strange surroundings began trembling, backing against the fence with the same terror Thomas had witnessed that October morning. "Easy there, Duke," Cross called out, using the name that made Caesar flinch. "Mr. Cross," Judge Whitmore said sharply, "please step back. Dr. Patterson, would you approach the animal?" Sarah moved toward Caesar with slow, professional calm. The bull immediately relaxed, allowing her to check his vital signs while she spoke softly about his recovery. When Thomas called Caesar's name, the massive bull walked directly to him, pressing his head against Thomas's chest in the gesture of trust that had developed over months of patient care. "Your Honor," Dr. Patterson testified, "this bull shows textbook signs of trauma associated with his previous owner, combined with complete trust in his rescuer. The medical evidence of prolonged abuse is overwhelming: malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma that manifests in terror responses to specific individuals." Earl Hutchins took the stand with the weight of 8 years of regret on his shoulders. "I raised Caesar from a bottle-fed calf. He was gentle, intelligent, never showed aggression. When I sold him to Cross, I thought I was providing good breeding stock to a legitimate rancher. Cross called me 3 months ago, bragging about dumping Caesar when he became unprofitable, said the bull wasn't worth the feed." The courtroom was silent as Earl's voice broke slightly. "I should have checked on him over the years. Should have made sure he was being treated right." Cross's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was mounting. When Thomas testified about finding Caesar dying in the ditch, about the months of expensive veterinary care, about the slow rebuilding of trust, even the judge's professional composure seemed affected. "Mr. Cross," Judge Whitmore said, "would you care to explain why this bull shows such extreme fear in your presence?" Cross's answer revealed everything about his character. "Animals need to respect authority. A bull that doesn't know who's boss is dangerous. Maybe Mitchell here's made him soft with all that coddling, but I can fix that quick enough." The statement hung in the courtroom like smoke from a grass fire. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened as she processed Cross's casual admission that he controlled animals through fear and intimidation. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, "what are your intentions regarding this bull if the court rules in your favor?" Thomas stood, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Your Honor, Caesar will live out his days in peace on my farm. He'll never be worked beyond his physical limitations, never be bred for profit, never be treated as anything other than the gentle soul he's proven himself to be. He deserves better than he got, and I aim to provide it." Judge Whitmore retired for deliberation, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Caesar waited in the parking lot, calm now that Cross had been ordered to keep his distance, occasionally accepting treats from children whose parents had brought them to witness history. When court reconvened an hour later, Judge Whitmore's voice carried the weight of law tempered by justice. "This court finds that while Mr. Cross may have had legal ownership of this bull at one time, his abandonment of the animal constituted relinquishment of that ownership. Georgia law recognizes that abandonment of domestic animals can void property claims, particularly when another party has assumed care and responsibility." She paused, looking directly at Cross. "Furthermore, the evidence of abuse and the animal's traumatic response to the original owner suggests that returning him would constitute animal cruelty under Georgia statutes." The courtroom erupted in applause that took several gavels to quiet. "Therefore, this court awards full ownership of the bull known as Caesar to Thomas Mitchell, along with reimbursement for veterinary expenses incurred during rescue and rehabilitation." As Cross stormed out, threatening appeals that everyone knew would fail, Thomas felt Caesar's warm breath on his shoulder. The bull had somehow sensed that the long uncertainty was over, that he was finally, legally, permanently safe. 6 months later, Caesar grazed peacefully in the pasture Thomas had expanded specifically for him. The bull's story had spread beyond Georgia, inspiring donations that helped Thomas establish a small rescue operation for abandoned farm animals. Children from local schools visited regularly, learning about compassion and second chances from a gentle giant who'd survived the worst of human nature to find the best. Thomas sat on his porch each evening, watching Caesar move through the pasture with the dignity that had always been his birthright. The bull who'd been discarded like garbage had become a symbol of resilience, proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. "Evening, Caesar," Thomas would call, and the massive bull would lift his head, dark eyes reflecting contentment instead of fear. They'd both learned that sometimes the most important battles weren't about property or law, but about defending the right of every living soul to be treated with kindness. The roadside ditch where Caesar had nearly died was now marked with a small sign, "Second chances start here." Thomas had placed it there as a reminder that mercy was always an option, even when the world seemed determined to drive past suffering without stopping. Some stopped now. Caesar's story had changed more than just one bull's fate. It had reminded an entire community that compassion was a choice, and choosing it could transform both the giver and the receiver in ways that no law or contract could ever measure. This story reminds us that true ownership isn't about legal documents. It's about love, care, and commitment to another being's well-being. Thomas Mitchell discovered that saving Caesar also saved himself, proving that acts of compassion create bonds stronger than any chain and more lasting than any law. No one helped. The old black bull injured on the roadside until a farmer found him and saved him. A 5-chapter story set in rural Georgia. No one helped. The old black bull injured on the roadside until a farmer found him and saved him.